What's up, guys? Jay Martin here. Now, if you are curious at all about how some of America's largest corporations have been able to push their agendas forward in ways that other companies never could because of their special relationship with government and government officials, then you're going to enjoy this interview. My guest today is Bart Elmore. He's the author of two books that cover two of the United States' most influential companies, one being Coca-Cola and the other being Monsanto. Now, Coca-Cola, an organization that grew into one of America's biggest companies through very effective market muscle, very effective lobbying, and some very interesting and strategic acquisition of natural resources in a way that other companies have still never been able to do. The second being Monsanto, a company that most people may not know was funded by Coca-Cola as their original producer and provider of caffeine in order for Coca-Cola to scale the way it did. Now we know Monsanto as the world's largest producer of seeds, and there's all sorts of nefarious stories between so many of the products that they've put on the shelf. So if you're curious how these two companies have been able to push their agendas despite producing products that are not in the public's best interest, in my opinion, this is a fascinating interview. So Bart is an amazing investigative journalist, historian, environmentalist. He spent 8 years writing his first book, Citizen Coke, 10 years writing his second book, Seed Money. And today we dive into the details of each. And this was a really fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Now, 3 things before we jump in to this interview. Number 1, this YouTube channel now produces a significant amount of ad revenue. I didn't see that coming when I started the channel, but it does, and that's awesome. So what I've decided to do with that cash is donate it to an organization that is super close to my heart called Zero Ceiling. Zero Ceiling's mission is to end youth homelessness. I love the work they do. Check them out if you're interested. Number 2, I author a weekly newsletter. Love to have you subscribe and join the team. There's a pinned comment right beneath this video where you can do so. It's probably my favorite thing that I do is write this newsletter every week, and I talk about whatever is front and center in my mind, what I'm watching in terms of global events, market forces, market events, anything like this. And number 3, if you prefer to listen to my content as opposed to watch it, you can find me wherever you listen to your podcast. Just search for The Jay Martin Show. Here is Bart Elmore. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, what's up, guys? Jay Martin here, investor and CEO of Cambridge House. And I'm joined right now by Bart Elmore, the author of 2 very interesting books that I want to dive into today. And they're going to lead us down some fun rabbit holes. So I'm excited for this conversation. And Bart, thanks so much for coming on and chatting with me.
Jay, thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure.
Okay, so, a good place to start for anybody who's not familiar with Citizen Coke or Seed Money, 2 books that I think are increasing in importance today. Maybe that's my opinion, but why don't we start with who you are and how you spend your time, Bart?
Yeah, it was interesting. We just started our first set of classes here at Ohio State University where I teach. And I had to tell the students I'm teaching this history of the environment and class, environmental history. And I told them I didn't even know it existed when I went to grad school. I went to school at the University of Virginia to study the history of the American South, actually, and ended up finding this field of environmental history in my second year of graduate work. And basically, the field is interested in the relationship between humans and the environment, both the ways in which nature shapes the course of human events, but also the ways in which humans can impact the environment as well. And I just fell in love. We were talking at one point, I was a paddler, a kayaker, a backpacker and a climber. And I was always really passionate about the environment. And wow, to fuse this with the field of history, something I loved as well. It was awesome. So I didn't want to leave the Southern component out of what I wanted to work on. So I chose a Southern business to write about for my dissertation, which became that book, Citizen Coke, The Making of Coca-Cola Capitalism. And essentially what I wanted to do was say, okay, here's this company from my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, Coca-Cola. What is its environmental footprint? How, and really a business question of how did Coke end up acquiring all the natural resources it needed at such low cost that it could be everywhere? That to me was a fascinating question. And so I wrote that book that looked at each of those ingredients, kind of went around the world. And that led me to the other book, Seed Money, because I was trying to figure out how caffeine, Coke sourced their caffeine. It was ungoogleable at the time. And I thought, okay, well, let's look into this. And it turned out that it was this chemical company from St. Louis that today we think of as a seed company, Monsanto that created all these genetically engineered crops in the 90s and onwards. But it started really supplying Coca-Cola with caffeine and saccharin, an artificial sweetener. So that was the segue into that second project. After I finished the Coke book, I wrote this history of Monsanto from start to finish. And here I am. I'm still alive to tell the tale. So it was a long journey.
Why do you say that, still alive to tell the tale? Elaborate on that a little bit. I could guess, but share with my audience.
Yeah, sure. I was naive just when I started, I think, as someone who, didn't think too much about the scale of these firms and just how powerful they were, and also how sensitive they might be to a graduate student writing about their history and their past in a way that might affect their stock price or affect their bottom line. In the case of Coca-Cola, when it came out, I would write a couple op-ed pieces and various things, and Coca-Cola would write in response to the pieces I would write. And, saying that this history is not very good and, you shouldn't pay attention to it. In fact, if people pick up the paperback, you'll see Coke's non-endorsement on the back of the book.
I saw that. Yeah, I did. Yeah. I was impressed.
This book lacks complete understanding of our history, basically. And, it was interesting. I remember being, I was young. I was in my 20s when I was writing that first book. It took about, 8 years to write. And that was nerve-wracking to have that kind of back and forth, and to wonder whether would there be litigation, or would there be some kind of backlash. But a great moment, Jay, that happened was I wrote a piece for Fortune magazine, and Coca-Cola was doing this routine. They wrote this response immediately to Fortune, and they wanted to get it published. But Fortune actually refused to publish that response because, unlike other public outlets, they called their bluff. They said, okay, you say that there's things that are inaccurate here, but tell us what's inaccurate. Show us what's the problem. And they sent me a paraphrase of the email they got from Coke. And the response was, well, we disagree with his interpretation, but nothing that he says is really inaccurate. And they said, well, that's not good enough, and refused to publish them. So, in a way, I was nervous about that. And one other story, Jay, about this with Monsanto. I chose not to give a lot of public talks or do op-eds when I was writing the Monsanto book, because I wanted to have accessibility to talk to people openly and freely about the business. But I gave one talk at a university out west. And the day after I gave that talk, I think even that evening, I got a call from the university. And the university told me that they'd saw on their caller ID, literally it said Monsanto on the caller ID. And much like we see in the Coke case, they wanted to give a rebuttal to my talk.
Okay.
What was so baffling about that was I was in the university. I was wondering, how on earth did they even know about this talk? And it turned out it was probably Facebook Live or some kind of feed that they were following and did that. And I remember kind of handshaking. I have two kids, and thinking about, okay, what does this mean for me personally as someone who writes about these companies in a very straightforward way? So that's kind of what I'm hinting at. This is a type of work, I think, where, it's challenging because you're dealing with your own personal exposure in a way as a writer. And you really have to be careful. You have to make sure that your stuff is backed up with facts. And I feel good about both of these books in that case.
Well, yeah, I guess it speaks to that. It's Fortune called Coca-Cola's bluff, asked them to elaborate on exactly what is it about this article that you disagree with. And they weren't able to provide enough to convince Fortune to publish the rebuttal. And yeah, it's an interesting dance you're doing, kind of toying with the underbelly of some of the most influential corporations in the world. Makes sense that you'd want to stay off the radar when you were authoring the book about Monsanto called Seed Money. Now, the story of Coke is interesting because what struck me is how they were able to generate some very interesting monopolies. And two that come to mind, and I'll stay super high level. I'd love you to elaborate on these, and then we're going to take it in a new direction. The monopoly on cocoa leaves, first of all, let's talk about that. Right. And there's a handful of stakeholders in that monopoly that are impacted. It's not as straightforward as you might think. And another interesting monopoly that you spoke about was the monopoly on U.S. troops. Right. Coca-Cola was the beverage of choice. And so could you just frame those two for me a little bit?
Yeah. And can I also say, Jay, thank you for reading. And I do a lot of interviews, and it's really nice to have people who've really gone in and know the material. So I appreciate that. Yeah. And because the Coca thing to me was also one of the most fascinating stories, right? And you gotta remember, when I was writing that book, I took the back of a Coke can and made that my table of contents. So I was traveling around the world looking at that ingredient list and saying, okay, where do they get their sugar? That was the writer's question. And I think any good writer, you got to have a question that drives you. Okay, how do they get the sugar? And I just dove into that and spent 2 years researching that. Okay, how do they get caffeine? And in this case, I was like, well, how do they get the coca leaf? Coca-Cola. I mean, it's in the name, right? And of course, I think most people know that Coca-Cola removed any trace of cocaine, the alkaloid that's in the coca leaf that is grown in the Andes, from their drink. But most people might not know that the coca leaf flavor, the coca flavor of that leaf without the cocaine in it, remained in the drink. It was part of what's known as merchandise number 5, or secret ingredient number 5. And I was super intrigued by this because I wanted to know, how did they get this? And to that bigger question, Jay, about, you're talking about a company that sells 1.9 billion servings of its product every single day.
Every day,
right? And it's like, okay, most writers that weren't environmental historians were like, what's the marketing and the advertising? And look at how skillful they were in the boardroom. That's great. But if you can't get the natural resource at low cost to be on every shelf, and by 1950, it was still being sold for 5 cents, that's a cheap product. You've got to have cheap raw materials. And that's the question that really drove me there, is how did they do that? How did they get it at such low cost? And it turns out that they essentially achieved a monopsony, which to your audience is more familiar than some of my students who don't have a business background. But, this single buyer access to a raw material, and in this case, the coca leaf. And basically, what Coke did throughout the 20th century was fight for not only national laws in the US that would ban the import of coca leaves into the United States. They also fought on the international scale at the UN and other places. Coke was there to try and ban the sale of coca leaves around the world, arguing that coca leaves, of course, could be turned into cocaine. That would be a narcotic that would be dangerous for society. They went so far, even in those discussions in the 60s, to try and push for the banning of indigenous chewing of coca leaves, which goes back thousands of years, hundreds of years, to religious practices in Peru and Colombia, which to me, when I saw that, was so startling. A company from the United States that's going to benefit from this product was actively arguing to try and prevent traditional chewing practices from going on. And so, it was crazy. By the 60s, you have this kind of international lockdown on the sale of coca leaves around the world. And Coke, though, has this special exemptions under US law to bring in coca leaves in the United States. So if the question is, how did they get coca leaves at such low cost? The answer is, when you cut out all the other potential buyers by negotiating and lobbying in that fashion, man, you're in a good spot to name your price. Yes. And they did so. And one other thing on that is that, Pepsi and these other companies, they did want access to the coca leaves. And this exemption, was essentially upheld for just Coke, while a lot of companies said, hey, we'd like access to this too. So it's a great example of how Coke was able to kind of corner a market in a way and get access to something that no one else could get.
Because it becomes the equivalent of a patent on a natural resource, right?
It's better than a patent. It's almost better, right? In the sense that you don't, if nobody can access it, this is great. I mean, probably as good as a patent is a better way to put it, but you're right. And, just to put a fine point on that, I spent time with people who represent the coquilleros in Peru. I traveled there. I think any good writer who's going to write about something should go and see the story that they're talking about. They should just depend on secondhand sources. And, the thing that I think irks everybody is it's in the name, it's Coca-Cola. And yet this history is completely not acknowledged by the firm, there's a interview that I did where it's kind of a back and forth between me and an archivist at Coca-Cola, where the guy is just literally like bending over, in different directions to try and get around the question of, does Coke have Coca in it? Right. And I just don't have to, I don't have to do that. The documents are there. They're in the National Archives, declassified, DEA documents. You can see this very clearly. This is not conspiracy theory stuff. And yet the company wants to kind of be hush hush about it. So that's that. You mentioned World War II.
Well, and I want to get into that too. And just to back up on the Coca leaves, because what struck me most about this is they're able to negotiate, and I want to say strong arm, a monopsony on the purchase of coca leaves from Peru, but not for some medical application or essential product or service. We're talking about a soft drink, right?
Right.
Like as all, you know what I mean? Like as non-essential as it gets. And you could argue it's actually, a catalyst for a major public health crisis. But that aside, what I'm curious about is, how do you think this was argued and negotiated? You share a little bit on that. They push the perception that coca leaves are used to produce cocaine. This is bad. We need to protect the public from this product, but let us have it, right? For a super recreational, non-essential product. And that's the thing. Like if it was for something medicinal grade, something essential, you could frame that in your mind and say it makes sense, right? Yeah. But so how do you think, therefore, this deal was negotiated and argued? Like what speculate? Yeah. Unless you know.
It was super complicated. So to your point, one angle that they took was to say, look, you are going to be bringing in coca leaves for legitimate medicinal uses, U.S. government. And that's true. The U.S. government was still bringing in leaves that could be used at hospitals for various surgeries and things like that. And so one of the things they negotiated was to say, we just want to make sure that when those medicinal leaves are brought in, we can use the flavor that's left over afterwards. And that seemed like a no-brainer. Okay, well, if we're going to bring in leaves and they're going to be coming in anyways, and you want this flavoring extract, no big deal. But to your point, the thing that was harder to negotiate, and this is in our laws, there are medicinal leaves that can be brought in, but there's another category, and they're called special leaves. And I actually love that title, special leaves. And those special leaves are essentially solely for Coca-Cola. And the reason was, as we said, Coke's growth was so exponential in the 20th century that those medicinal leaves weren't enough. They needed more, right? And so they had to broker that special deal. And I think that's to your point. They had to argue, like, we need to bring in these leaves because we need it. And I think that actually shows you something more, as you said, how could they do that? A lot about their strategy as a business in terms of the revolving door of government officials and Coke officials, really trying hard at times either to take people that were in government and then bring them into Coca-Cola. I'm thinking of Farley as a great example of this, somebody who worked high in the Democratic Party, who becomes the head of the kind of export arm of Coca-Cola. And then the reverse, finding ways to put people like Ed Forio, another executive inside the company, on the sugar rationing board during World War II to help negotiate how sugar was going to be rationed in the United States, and really working that. And same, you see this with Monsanto too, making sure that those people there's a kind of access via people who are going back and forth between state and private entities. Sure. And I think that plays out in this case for sure.
Because at the end of the day, it's a conversation in the boardroom, right? And so relationships matter. Understanding the angles matters. So that's exactly where I wanted to get this to, because so let's now go to the monopoly on veterans, the monopoly on troops, and how Coca-Cola became the only beverage provider.
Yeah, I like how you put it, a monopoly on troops. I don't think I've ever said it that way, but it's true. It's like you've got this kind of monopsony going on the supply side, but then there was also like the demand side. Like that's the smartness of Coke, was figuring out, how do we make sure we're the brand that's in front of a particularly important group of people. And I can't think of a more important group of people than World War II veterans, because the long-term effects of that are hard to to understate. That if people are drinking Coke on D-Day and they come home and their kids saying they're going to drink a Pepsi, that Pepsi's getting slapped out of their hand. You're not drinking Pepsi, and you're not smoking anything but Marlboros, and you're only eating Hershey, which is also part of the rations that these guys got. But yeah, you're right. I mean, so it was crazy to see that Coke essentially, and this is interesting to your point. How did it happen? It mattered that someone like Dwight Eisenhower, who was Supreme Allied Commander, liked Coke. You could argue was courted by Coke for years too. And when he was president, again, Coke was very careful to be very close to the executive branch and the people in power. But Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower writes a letter to basically the government saying, we want billions and billions of Coca-Colas. And he didn't say Pepsi. He didn't say, these other things. He said Coca-Cola. And the argument at that time was sugar was energy. We think of sugar now as like this terrible thing that, it's a health problem and obesity and things like that. But during the war, it was like, this is immediate fuel, gasoline that we can provide to our troops on the front lines. And, Coke ends up getting these exemptions because you've got people like Eisenhower and others. And again, it's a two-way street. Coke is also negotiating this, saying, look, you should do this. And they have people inside government who are negotiating this. But it was really unique. Basically, most companies that were selling sugar were capped at 80% of their pre-war sugar consumption during the war. They couldn't use but up to 80% of what they were using in 1941, roughly 1940, during the war. The idea was we need sugar for the troops, so you're going to be capped.
Okay.
Coke, because of the exemptions they got, was allowed to supply as much sugar, get as much sugar as they needed, as long as they were supplying the troops. And because the Coca-Cola was the company that was getting these contracts, Coke was getting, they were kept at 80% of their domestic market. They could only use 80% of their sugar at the domestic market, but they had this huge international market with troops overseas, and they could get as much sugar as they needed as long as they were servicing troops. And so they explode in sales, whereas Pepsi doesn't get this deal. And there's a great letter in the National Archives from the head of Pepsi saying basically WTF, like, how could you be giving these guys this contract and deal that allows them to provide, their products to the troops and keep us at 80%? We're going to lose. And for folks who want to know why Pepsi's number 2 and Coke's number 1, it's a big stop in the story. Like,
yes,
Coke got a huge deal and Pepsi did not. And it took years. You could argue Michael Jackson and the endorsement of Michael Jackson for Pepsi to get back in the game in the 1980s.
Yeah.
But they were so far behind because of that deal. And it's just another example of, I think, the state and how important government and relationships to the government were to a brand like Coca-Cola.
Those relationships are maybe where I want to focus on as we jump into your next book, Seed Money, right? Following the thread of how products end up on the shelf, right? Regardless of maybe their nefarious ingredients or impact, right? So give us the highlight overview of Seed Money. It's the story of Monsanto and the relationship with Coca-Cola, which is really interesting. But give us the overview. Yeah.
And as I said, I was writing the Coke book and I was trying to figure out how Coke got their caffeine. And it took me to St. Louis, Missouri, to the archives. And this is important for people to know, as a business scholar, you're looking for a base of resources to be able to tell your story. It took me almost a decade to finish this book on Monsanto. And as a writer that you have to have corporate records. And so what was the great moment for me when writing the Coke book was arriving in St. Louis and getting access to Monsanto's corporate records. That was a deal. That was like a jaw-dropping moment. I said, whoa, I now have access to their corporate records, which isn't always granted, And so that was when I started this Monsanto book, thinking about their origins as a company that was providing caffeine and chemicals to the soft drink industry in 1901. And then what I wanted to do was say, well, how the heck did they become a company that became so big in agriculture. The largest seller of genetically engineered seeds in the world. Like how did they get from that caffeine and saccharin to that? And that became the book. That was really the story, is answering that question. That's why I call it seed money. In fact, it was a really good friend of mine in Charlottesville, Virginia. His hand was shaking. He had a beer in his hand. He said, "Dude, I've got the title of this book for you." And I was like, "What?" And he's in business, and he was like, "It's seed money." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, it's brilliant." Yes. So yes. Jesse Pappas gets all the credit there, because it really was about, everyone wants to talk about the seed business of Monsanto, but I wanted to get that seed money story. Like, how did they even grow? How did they get to the point where they could have that kind of power on our food system? And that was really the question that drove that book.
Okay, now, what today would you say are the biggest controversies behind Monsanto and the products that we find on the shelf? And post acquisition of Bayer, et cetera. But like, what today do you think is an example of how, call it the wool being pulled over the public's eyes to keep a product on the shelf that we know is horrible for us, but it remains there regardless? What are some examples that come to mind?
And I think that's a great follow-up question, because that was the question I had to answer. If they had seed money that made them so powerful, how do they survive all these huge controversies that I knew were part of their history? And that was part of the questions. Like, how did they survive, for example, Agent Orange, right?
Yes.
They were the largest supplier of this herbicide called Agent Orange to the US military during the Vietnam War. It was contaminated with a compound called dioxin, which even the industry itself in 1965 said, and this is a quote, is the most toxic compound we've ever seen. So how did a company that was saying that internally, or talking about that internally, who's selling this to the US military, it's going to be sprayed in Vietnam. It's still in the environment today. I traveled to Vietnam to see that story. It's still affecting people's lives. How did they survive, and then become this company that can provide our food?
Yeah.
Same thing with PCBs, polychlorinated bipheноls. They were the only producer of this chemical in the United States, PCBs. Some people may be familiar with it, but if you're not, it was a material that was used in insulating, kind of as an insulating fluid in most transformers, electrical equipment. But it was used in not just in that, but in almost everything. Like, it was in paint that was in pools. It was in the paint and silos that held our food. It was in carbonless paper. It was in Christmas trees, artificial Christmas. It was everything. And once again, it's described as a dioxin-like compound, just has all these Darth Vader-like effects on your body and health, produced by only this company and sprayed, put on everything, clearly identified in the 1960s as a super toxic product. How do they survive that? Like, how does a company not just survive one? You think about asbestos, like, okay, a lot of these companies failed. I mean, Monsanto gets through Agent Orange, PCBs. They also made DDT, which was, of course, Rachel Carson and concerns about that. So that was what was interesting to me, is like, they made some of these, the most notorious compounds the world's ever seen. And yet, come out the other side, not only looking good, but as you said, looking so good that Bayer, this pharma life sciences company in Germany, acquires them in 2018, saying, "Wow, this is a great company to buy."
Right.
What gives is I think the question of the book.
100%. Yeah. Now, did you uncover a similar, as you put it, a revolving door of government officials and corporate executives and relationships did you find that path with Monsanto?
Yeah, absolutely. A very cozy relationship between government and especially the regulators and the regulated. I think even the science that's being used to decide whether certain compounds, Roundup, of course, I know is on everyone's mind, the herbicide that became a blockbuster brand for the company. They basically create this in the 1970s, and it's the most widely used herbicide in the world by the 1990s. You look back at this, at how this gets approved, and just the ways in which there's kind of this, some of the science is coming from the very company that's being regulated. I teach at Ohio State University. One of the things I filed when writing this book was a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request, with my own institution. Talk about a moment where you fear for your own uh, future. I'm basically not only looking at Monsanto, but my own employer about the relationships between them. And sure enough, millions of dollars being spent by Monsanto on agricultural science here that looks like public science, right?
Sure.
And so for me, yes, you see a very similar story of just a lack of firewalls, really, between people that are being regulated and the agencies that are doing the regulating.
Explain that to me, a lack of firewalls, please.
Yeah, I think a good example would be dicamba, an herbicide that's come out recently that's really problematic. It spreads off target, and when you spray it in hot conditions, it vaporizes and will drift onto neighboring farms. And if you don't have Monsanto, now Bayer's seeds that make your crops resistant to dicamba, it'll kill your crops. I mean, the dicamba can spread and damage your crops. So one of the questions was, how on earth did this get approved? And
so we're talking about a herbicide that essentially that travels in hot weather, landing on neighboring crops, that really vaporizes them, if I understand correctly, right?
It doesn't so much vaporize. It vaporizes and goes up into the air. If you can imagine this, you're spraying it in June or July in Arkansas, okay? And because it's so hot, this stuff turns into little droplets, and it jumps up into, and there can even be inversions where full clouds of this stuff will drift and spread onto neighboring farms. And when it hits those plants that are on other farms that don't have crops, and this is the key, that are genetically engineered to tolerate dicamba. And that's what Monsanto was selling, right? Not only the herbicide dicamba, but the seeds that would make your plants resistant to dicamba.
Yeah.
You're going to get hit. And it can hit everything. It hits vineyards, it hits watermelon plants, it can hit peach orchards. I mean, the number of farmers who have been upset about this for the last half decade is thousands of farmers who call me, by the way, and will say, they'll stop their tractor in the middle of harvest, on top of a hill, to call me to say, this is outrageous that this is an approved product for use on our fields. And, in my investigative research on this, getting access to people even inside the company, one of the things that was clear was the ways in which regulators were relying on data that was coming from Monsanto to decide about how volatile it was.
Okay.
And you can't do that, as we see in this case. Clearly it volatilizes, clearly it vaporized, but Monsanto said, no, our studies show that it doesn't. Well, if an independent agency had come in and done that study, they would have seen this, and it probably would have prevented the problem. So that's where we need this. We need a much finer firewall between the entities who have vested interest in getting this stuff approved and the agencies that are regulating it.
Now, I know after the acquisition, after Bayer bought Monsanto, they, applied a bit of lip service here, and a product like Roundup, I believe, is supposed to be taken off the shelves from consumers like you and I by 2023. However, it's still going to be used commercially. Is that correct? So this is a good public stunt. Say, don't worry, we acknowledge this is unsafe, so we're pulling it off the shelves, the retail shelves, but obviously there's no slowdown in commercial application. Do I understand that correctly?
That's correct. Exactly. So, and just to back up a little bit on that, I have to tell you, you got to imagine writing this book. It's like being an investor and watching the implosion of a business that you've just invested in or something. In my case, I'm writing about this firm and Monsanto, and then I'm like, I had no idea that Bayer was going to buy them. You got to remember, I started this, as I said, almost a decade ago. So that was long before those talks really even were underway. And I'm watching, as I'm writing, Bayer, and I'm looking at all these documents and all these discussions I'm having and internal discussions with whistleblowers and other people. And I'm like, what is Bayer doing? Honestly, that's what I was saying as a writer. I thought, this is a bad move. And they're doing this in the summer of 2018. And they buy Monsanto, Bayer does. And then the first Roundup case and we should be clear, this was a case involving a California gardener who sprayed Roundup every day, or on the regular basis, and developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Argued that his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was linked to his exposure to Roundup, and he wins that case. Just right after that merger happens.
Yeah, right.
And their stock price tumbles.
Yeah.
A second case comes to court in California, and it's also finds in favor of the plaintiff for hundreds of millions of dollars. And then by the spring, there's a third case. And I'm just watching this happen. And you're watching that ticker go like this.
Yeah.
I bought a Bayer stock so I could go to the shareholders meeting. And
all right.
And you're just watching your stock price go down. But as a writer, I was just interested in what's happening. And Bayer was worth the same amount of money that they paid to acquire Monsanto. By the end of all those three cases coming out against them, they had lost essentially, I think by the end of it all, it was like a half of their market cap. I mean, it's hard to think of scenarios, where this happens on a day-to-day basis, right? And so Monsanto, Bayer had to do something, and it was unclear what they were going to do. And so their move, as you said, was, okay, look, we're going to agree to remove Roundup, this herbicide, from the Home Depot, Lowe's, things like that. But it's going to continue to be used on farms, which is the main use at scale, yes, which is huge, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not really a solution.
No, it's a marketing tactic, right?
It is. And the other thing they had to do, though, was to settle all these cases. Just to be clear, there were 120,000 filed and about to be filed cases around 2018, 2019, related to Roundup.
How could you miss that in the diligence when you're buying Monsanto? Like, that's a pretty important data point that this is sitting in the periphery.
And note this, the CEO before Werner Baumann, who is the current CEO and chairman, he did not think they should acquire Monsanto for precisely the reasons you're talking about, the legacy issues. So some people say, well, they must have seen something we didn't see. I wasn't obviously in those boardroom meetings, but I will tell you that I know that people were clearly didn't think it was a smart idea. But there were, other folks who said, no, this technology is so amazing. And remember, Monsanto was the largest genetically engineered seed company in the world. This isn't from a business perspective. You can see the allure, which is this is like a software. And this is, by the way, how they think about it in that industry. They think of like the seeds as like floppy disks.
Okay. Right.
It's like, this is a software that goes into every computer. It's like, the Microsoft Office suite, If we have these seeds, then we really are in control. Like, this is our way of deploying whatever technology we want. If we can acquire Monsanto, we've got this great advantage. You can see that counter argument.
Yeah.
But given these legacies, it's like, what were they doing? So they worked to negotiate a settlement for the vast majority of those cases. I think some 90,000 of them, set aside something like $15 billion to do that. It's $15 billion. But the thing is, there's tens of thousands of cases that I know, because I've been just talking to people and things like that aren't going to settle, Okay. So they're stuck in a way. I don't know what everybody should be watching this Bayer story, because it's a saga that I never saw coming, and I don't know how they get out of this.
Well, and I find myself wondering if this is a gamble that still may pay off. I mean, I get it. Anybody in that business, anybody in any, we're watching the food demand story, right? And I'm looking for opportunities to invest in food production. And I found some cool companies building like vertical farming equipment and all sorts of neat stuff, right? I think we can follow this narrative and say, it's an important sector to follow or invest in if you're looking for that. So put yourself in Bayer's shoes. It's like, yeah, there's some massive risk with this acquisition, but it's Monsanto. They're the largest provider of seeds in the world, in a world that's going to be increasingly underfed, arguably, right? So, can they navigate this and come out on top still? I think it's yet to be determined from a corporate standpoint, not ethically, and it's a different conversation, but
Jay, I think one thing I would say, and like, that's a great point, but I would just add that the reason I think my book is different than other books on Monsanto that people might pick up if they're an investor or somebody that's interested is that it shows you the other liabilities that are there. Roundup is just one.
Yeah.
I mean, PCBs, the thing that people should go out and read about right now is that states, whole-on states, like Washington State, Maryland are filing suit against Monsanto right now for cleaning up PCB contamination. And by Monsanto, I mean Bayer. So on top of Roundup right now, you have states that are saying, wait a minute, these PCBs are still in our environment. They're still affecting people's health. This company never cleaned it up in the 60s and 70s. We're going to make them pay.
Sure.
So on top of the Roundup litigation, you've got this huge liability with PCBs. And then we haven't really talked about Agent Orange, but that's ongoing still.
Yes. Yes.
So,
yeah. And there's so we could, okay, that's a great counterpoint. And it'll be interesting to watch then, therefore, how this plays out. Can you navigate this storm? But where I want to go next, though, just because there's two big buckets I still want to cover with you. So I'm watching the clock here, but, on a personal level, Bart, like how you spent 8 years writing Citizen Coke, another close to a decade writing Seed Money. You've been very, buried in the underbelly of some of the largest corporations that produce products. We have been sold their safe health, and how do you therefore navigate? I guess my question is like, I'm a capitalist. I don't know of a better system, right? There's downsides to capitalism, absolutely. And we just covered a bunch of them, but what's the alternative? I don't know of a better system. When I look at relationships that can be built between organizations like the EPA and the FDA and corporations to get products on the shelf, how do you navigate the world? After diving into, topics of this depth, when it comes to things like trusting the products you're purchasing, you've got two young kids. When it comes to trusting the food supply, trusting the water supply, right? How do you do that?
That's such a good question, Jay. I'll tell you, when I was down in Brazil, I was with some farmers talking about Roundup and all this stuff. And I told them about all the things I've uncovered so far and stuff. And the guy just turns to me and he was speaking English and kind of an accent. And he said to me, Bart, never write about beer. The point was, he didn't want to have beer pulled from his list of things he couldn't consume,
Ignorance is bliss. Yeah.
And I feel that too. There are times, and during the pandemic, I'll have to say, like, I've let loose some of my rules and because I needed some sanity, and
what kind of rules? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, just trying my best to limit the amount of pesticides, chemicals that I might have in my food by choosing and again, I'm very aware that this is not a choice that everyone has in terms of buying organic or buying, at the farmer's market or knowing your farmer, which I've had the luxury of doing at times, and really spending time to develop relationships so that you feel good about the food that you're eating, maybe curbing those rules a little bit here and there and getting a guilty pleasure every now and then over the pandemic has been what I've done a little bit. But no, I mean it seriously. I do live the history that I've written about. I think about it all the time, given the murkiness of what we can know about. And it's not just Roundup. I think Roundup is interesting and it's complicated and there's a lot of discussions about it. But as I said, dicamba. I mean, one of the things that's happening now is because we're creating all these resistant weeds, we're spraying more herbicides and a variety of them to try and deal with all these weeds that are getting resistant to different herbicides. And we're using more herbicides than we ever did before.
Right.
We think maybe we're getting more environmentally friendly. Actually, it's the opposite when it comes to herbicides. So it's the confluence of all these chemicals in our food system that scares me the most. The interactions between them that one can't possibly know what it means to, on a day-to-day basis, be consuming small amounts of dicamba, small amounts of glyphosate, small amounts of these things. So to your point, whenever I possibly can, I'm trying to eat food that I know was grown in a way that didn't have those pesticide inputs. And that's not just because I care about my kids, and I do. I mean, I look at them every day, as we all do as parents, and it's just like, you just feel this visceral sense of protection. But it's also because I care about workers. I care about people who produce my food. And they're getting exposed to this stuff on a much higher scale. When you're talking about Roundup or herbicides or pesticides. And so if you care not only about your family, but you care about the people who make your daily bread, then I think you really have to think, how can I, with my dollar, and it's only one action, I get that. It's not a structural change, but it can make a difference to say, I'm not going to purchase stuff that is connected to that world, that's connected to an agricultural system that, in my mind, clearly from this book, after spending 10 years on it, is broken. You said water. Yeah, I mean, I have an APEC filter in my house, a 5-layer reverse osmosis filter. Talk about, not everybody can have the access to do that, although I will say it's cheap. It's, relatively cheap. It's like $150 to install. You can do it yourself. Change out the filters every 6 months. And I did that because I had chemistry students here at Ohio State even come in to test our tap water, and, just low levels of stuff that's in our tap water. We're in an agricultural state. So the agricultural runoff that comes into our water supply, I'm a stickler for that kind of stuff. I just don't want on a daily basis to have, and maybe that'd be fine. That's great, but I'd rather not take the risk. And there are cool technologies in terms of water filtration that we now have that we definitely do that in our house, and we care about these things. So I think it's interesting. You touched clearly on a nerve in a way, like it's changed my life doing this type of work. It's made me be much more careful as a spouse, as a husband, as a parent. And I'm happy that I've learned this stuff. I'd rather not be ignorant about the number of chemicals that are out there, given how many there are and how many questions I have about them.
Well, it strikes a chord with me too, because at the foundation of all the content I produce, and when I started, my podcast and my YouTube channel, it came from a place of demanding financial sovereignty, right? Personal sovereignty. But for me, where I sat at the moment, it was financial confidence and independence, right? And as you can follow that sovereignty thread, right, to a place of, we're on our own out here, right? And it's really important to recognize that no one's got your back, right? And that's fantastic news because it puts you in the driver's seat, actually, right? But as soon as you want to hand over control to, call it government bodies or whatever, like the FDA or the APA, you're massively compromising your future in a variety of ways. And that's not to point the finger and say there's conspiracies at play, they're bad actors, all of this stuff. I think it's a real false sense of security to think that an organization like the APA or the FDA can actually have the bandwidth, right, to make such a wide breadth of good decisions in everybody's best interest. It's never going to be realistic to expect that. So to put yourself in the driver's seat, it takes a lot of work to maybe think critically and about your water supply and understand that, maybe we shouldn't be consuming all these phthalates every day. Maybe it's not a great choice, right? Glyphosate's in our food system.
Yeah, I think, I totally hear you. And I think I might put it slightly differently. One thing I would at least say is, having talked to EPA people and things, I do respect the work they do. And I really care about, there's a lot of good people trying to do the right thing and trying to regulate, trying to step in and make sure their bad actors are held accountable. And so I feel for these agencies that are often underfunded and undersupported and these types of things. But you're right. I mean, one of the things I say in this book, or especially on this tour I've been on, is that speak up, but if something's being sprayed next to you in your neighbor, or wherever yard, or if it's on somebody else's farm, ask questions. As you said, don't expect that somebody's there that's out there monitoring the water supply, making sure it's okay. Because I will tell you, the EPA doesn't have that capacity to do that on the scale we think it does, to get to that granular level,
Yeah.
So I think the big lesson of this book, and to me, is you have to be watchful. You have to be asking questions. You have to be pounding on doors. You have to be the one that says, like, hey, like, what are you spraying? I want to know more about it. Like, because I think we think people are watching, but in many cases they're not. And I think that's good advice.
Yeah, we think people are watching, right? We think someone's got our back, right? This is on the shelf. It's regulated, therefore it must be safe, right? That's what FDA exists for, right? But to your point, it's and again, I'm agreeing with you. I'm saying, it's a mistake to point the finger and say they're obviously evil, right? It's a bandwidth issue. It's an unrealistic expectation to think somebody else could have your back across all facets of your life. You got to take control. You're the only one that can, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of things we can do. And I think and that also, I think involves, there's a lot of public hearings, for example, in this story. I think of the Roundup story where Roundup is made in Soda Springs, Idaho. And it's this crazy story. Roundup creates radioactive waste of all things when you manufacture it, which is just bizarre. And I never expected to see that. I ended up camping out there at a Superfund site. Not the best camping experience of my life, I'll say, worrying about what my exposure to toxic waste, but you got to get the story. So that's what you do. And, I'm out there and reading these documents while I'm there too. They're holding these public hearings, but sometimes people just don't show up, like it's that kind of lack of just like, but what if people did show up? What if people had raised their voice and said, you know what, like, this is wrong. What's happening here? Like, could there have been change? So I think, this is a story of, and the Citizen Coke, just to put a fine point on that again, the title for me was a story of citizen empowerment. I wanted people to see at the end of the book that, like, stop waiting for Coca-Cola to fix our problems. Right. Everyone keeps saying that. It's like corporate responsibility. And what can Coke do to solve the problem? Like, stop waiting for Coke to solve your problem, whether it be a health problem, I'm going to drink Diet Coke or whatever. We are the ones who pay for recycling. We're the ones who pay for that. We're the ones who built that. So we can be the ones, the citizens of this country who shape the future and make it better. So
I love that. I love that. Now let's so, there's a need for products like what Monsanto produces because we rely on monocrop agriculture, which is incredibly unnatural and therefore very vulnerable to pests and et cetera, et cetera. And so in order to make that system work, we had to make what's going on my camera here? Other chemicals to facilitate it. So, a question for you, Bart, like, based off what you've learned, is it possible, right? Would it be possible for the United States, for example, to transition to regenerative agriculture at enough scale to feed the country, right? Is that a possibility?
I think it's not only a possibility, but it has to be the future. As we're saying, I mean, if you're following this as closely as people like myself and others who really dove into this deeply, when you look at weeds that are developing resistance to herbicides and the chemical input system that we have, when you look at the tremendous fossil fuel input that's needed to sustain the current style of agriculture, that's not going to work if you're legitimately going to say we're not going to be a fossil fuel economy 10, 20 years down, 20, 30 years down the road. And so I think regenerative is not just a possibility, it's got to be the way we think. And that's where I might say, when it comes to structural things, I do think that the state played a big role in getting us into this situation, the USDA and subsidies that were provided to make this possible. Unfortunately, because of those choices, I do think there's going to have to be some structural changes that help us get to regenerative agriculture. Okay. The subsidy systems that are in place now that are supporting what I see as a broken agricultural system. Maybe a way to transition to regenerative is to see if we can channel some of those funds to help farmers retool, to help them readapt to a different style of agriculture. But it's going to be a long road. We have a long way to go. But what I will say, what I'm heartened by is just that people are talking about regenerative. You're talking about it, Jay. I feel like it's becoming a term that's more, it's not seen as pie in the sky. And I think for some reason it's getting more traction than organic, which I think for whatever reason was vilified as being so niche and not possible on scale and things like that. It's nice to see that people are talking about regenerative and saying we can do this with 5,000, 6,000, 10,000 acres,
Right.
And believe it. So, and farmers are showing also that it can be profitable. I think that's a good news for us.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think part of this transition, in order for it to be successful, will be consumers adjusting our expectations? Like globalization's provided me an incredible amount of conveniences. Like I live in the Pacific Northwest. It's really cold here, but I can have bananas fresh whenever I want. Maybe that's not something I should have access to in a sustainable world. What do you think about that?
From start to finish, you've been just teeing me off in our conversation. Like, I was going to say banana because, that's the classic example. If anyone's interested in this, another great historian, John Stolori, a book called Banana Cultures, that's all about this, that part of it does have to be just accepting maybe a red banana, for example. We want a Cavendish yellow banana, which, by the way, tastes terrible. If you've ever tasted other bananas, there's so many other great bananas, but they don't. Some of them, they bruise easily, or some of them, they don't look that great on the outside, but they're tasty on the inside. Part of it is expectations, and also maybe saying, "Do I need a banana at this time of year? Could I get it some other time?"
Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right, and we have a system that just makes it think that those things are normal. The banana just being there every day. And trust me, my kids go through enough to make me think that how would we survive? But it is about us. And it goes back to it. I think I'm seeing, Jay, some of the things that you're excited about. I mean, I think we can be a part of that change. We can make the decisions to say, okay, that tomato has a blemish on it, but it's okay. Like expecting that perfect looking fruit is part of the problem for sure.
Right. Okay. Now I want to ask you to wrap up here for a couple pieces of advice that we could share with my audience. Now it's easy to, we both said, it's maybe sometimes hard to make the changes towards healthier options, right? Organic's more expensive. You got to add filtration systems to your water, all this stuff, but not everything adds complications. For example, we have I feel like we have a pretty clean household when it comes to food. My friends think we're incredibly complicated because they see our diet as all the things we won't or don't eat, right? Which is one way to look at it. The way I look at it is I'm like, no, it's really basic. It's called plants and animals, right? That's it. You know what I mean? It couldn't get any simpler, to be honest with you, right? We eat what we eat, and it's not about all the things we don't or we avoid. It's just about what we allow in our household. When it comes to navigating this, like, are you growing your own food? Are there some simple rules or pieces of advice that you could share with my audience so that they could take some easy steps towards a healthier, less exposed diet? Let's start there.
Yeah. My friend put it this way, because it sounds like we have similar friends. One of mine said, when I was telling him about what I was going to eat for the day, he said, "Well, Bart, I don't have a tortured relationship with food." And, I wanted to come back with him and say, I don't either, It's not tortured. In fact, it's bountiful and great and yummy and delicious. It's just thoughtful. And I think the first thing I would say is it's easy to not pay attention, and to just be okay with just accepting, just eating what's ever put on your plate for you. Kind of what you were saying. I mean, like kind of just a kind of herd mentality of I'm at this restaurant, and so I'm just going to eat what they give me. I joke that not joke, but I say, one of the biggest pieces of advice I'd say is if you're at a restaurant or whatever, ask questions. Like where's this from? Or like, where's it sourced from? And I often will not eat certain things because nobody can tell me where it's coming from. And they don't. And sometimes I'm often astounded with what I hear. This comes from this farm. This is the relationship we have with them. Mm-hmm. This is what, and that kind of thing. And I think, and that's what I mean about being a nag, which I said earlier, just be a nag, and not in a way that's just, that I guess that term makes it sound like you're going to sound like a jerk, but ask questions. When you're at the grocery store, look at the label, pay attention. I think, staying away from non-GMO products, especially when they actually are non-GMO. Now, non-GMO salt, like that's just silly, and you're going to see products like that. Don't be fooled by that kind of stuff either. There is no non-GMO salt, it's just, like, that's part of the problem too, is these labels and things are all over the place. Knowing enough about the food system to say, it doesn't matter with salt. It's salt,
right?
But it does matter with corn. Yeah. And it does matter with soybeans. And so going in there and saying, okay, when it says non-GMO on this, it means they're not spraying during the growing season, glyphosate and dicamba on this stuff. That makes me feel good. Organic, again, is another great label. There are still some chemicals that can be used and on those products, but generally they're more natural based. It's just a better choice. So I think, asking those questions and like I said, when you're watching out in the world, something happening, something being sprayed, a chemical happening around your property or around where you live, ask questions, be a voice, because as we said, oftentimes no one's watching. Mm-hmm. And you're your best guard and defense, not only for yourself, but you could protect your neighbors and people around you from harm that they don't even know is going on in their backyard. So I'm that guy. I try and do it. As you can see, I'm not a mean person. I try and do it with a smile and have a conversation, but I'm always asking questions, and always trying to push people to tell me where things come from and what this compound is that's going to be sprayed near where I live and where my kids play.
Right. Bart, look, I love it. You're a really important voice and you ask really important questions. So I really appreciate you. And thanks so much for coming on and chatting with me. It means the world.
Jay, this was really a pleasure. I mean, honestly, it really means a lot when people read work that you work so long and hard on and ask good questions about it. So I'll be tuning in a lot to your show and listening in.
Sweet. That's great. Well, I can't wait to see what you author next, man. And what a journey, like 8 years on the first book, 10 years on the second. Did I get that timeline right?
Yeah, it's a weird thing. And historians are so different than journalists and they're great. Journalists, will take a story and sometimes pop out a book in 2 years. I don't know how they do it, but you sit a lot of the time with the material. And so this is the best part of what we do, getting to connect with people like yourself. And it's an honor to be able to chat with you. So thanks.
The best part of what I do is getting to read a book and then chat to the author about it, man. It's the best. Everybody should start a podcast for that reason, I swear. Okay. Look, man, I appreciate your time. It's been great getting to know you, Bart, and I'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah. I'll look you up if I'm ever up in your neck of the woods.
100%, man.
All right, man. Thanks a lot.
Okay, guys, 3 last things. First, if you enjoy my interviews and would like a bit more, you can subscribe to my Friday newsletter. It's free, and the comment to subscribe is right beneath this video in that pinned comment. In this newsletter, I share my key lessons learned, takeaways, and any actions that I might be taking in the market as a consequence of what I've learned on the show. Second, when I started a YouTube channel, I never anticipated generating any advertising revenue. But coincidentally, I do now, which is awesome. And so what I've decided to do is donate this to an organization that is very close to my heart called Zero Ceiling. Their mission is to end youth homelessness. The way they do this is by providing young people experiencing homelessness with supportive housing, employment, professional support, life skills, and outdoor adventure. Because often young people in urban centers with no resources will never get the opportunity to experience wild places, nature that can be so transformational, and absolutely was for me. Third, if you prefer to listen to my content, you can now find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for The Jay Martin Show.